Welcome to the Friday Independent Sage briefing. On Wednesday, the government announced its intention to move to Plan B. This will usher in a series of new measures designed to tackle the spread of the Omicron variant and ease pressure on the NHS over the winter. So these measures include working from home where possible, mandatory face masks in all public places, and vaccine passports for large venues such as nightclubs and stadiums. While it's known that the new variant is spreading quickly, it's still unclear whether it leads to more serious illness or how much protection our current vaccines will offer against it. So with those uncertainties in mind, Independent Sage has today released a statement outlining some additional measures that it believes we should be putting in place in order to buy us more time over the coming weeks, not just to learn more about this variant, but to get more people vaccinated. Professor Stephen Reicher will be talking through these latest recommendations today, and we'll also be joined by some special guests. We have Rachel Clark, who is a palliative care doctor and author, and also two members of the Independent Sage Behavioural Advisory Group, Elizabeth Stocko, Professor of Social Interaction at Loughborough University, and John Drury, Professor of Social Psychology at the University of Sussex. They'll be helping us answer the difficult question, is there an acceptable number of deaths in a pandemic? But first of all, we are going to go to Professor Christina Pargle, who will brief us on the latest facts and figures. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you. I'm going to try and keep this short because I know we've got a lot to get through today. And so I'm going to give a very brief overview of cases and hospitalizations and vaccinations and where we are with those. And then just give you an update on where we are with Omicron, because a lot has happened since last Friday. So for cases, this is cases over the UK up to yesterday. You can see we're back kind of pretty much at where we were last July. We've had a lot of cases over 50,000 a day recently. Breaking it down by nation, you can see in the recent few days, this is only going up to 4th of December because it's by date of test. Cases are going up in all nations now. If we just look at regions in England, I just wanted to highlight this because the two regions that are increasing a bit faster than everywhere else are London and the South East. We do know that both of these are places where Omicron is spreading, but all regions are now seeing an increase. One thing I wanted to highlight about London is that it's currently the only region that's seeing an increase in the over 60s, which is a little bit worrying. And also just bear in mind that London is the region that has the lowest vaccination rates in England. Just by age, it is still highest in school-aged children. It's still going up in school-aged children. It's been a bit of a bad term in terms of COVID, but actually it's going up in all age groups now, except for the over 60s. The ONS infection survey today kind of shows a similar picture. And again, you know, it's 1 to 2% of adults have COVID and about 4% of school-aged children. And I just want to highlight, you know, we've got kind of used to these numbers, but they're really high. You know, up to 1 in 50 adults and 1 in 25 children currently have COVID. And the other thing, just to say about the other nations, is that the school age pattern, the pattern that the cases are highest in school age children is true for every home nation. And in fact, most European countries, and cases in under 20s are increasing in all nations, so also Northern Ireland and Scotland as well, and Wales. Looking at hospitalizations, I'm actually not showing deaths this week because of time, but hospitalizations are coming down in all nations apart from England, where they're plateauing. And if we look at England admissions, unfortunately, what we're seeing now, like last week, we saw a hint of them going up, and they have been going up all this week. So that is unfortunate. And this is all Delta, right? None of this is Omicron. This is a Delta increase that's driving these admissions. In terms of deaths, we are still at, you know, well over 100 deaths a day, and we've been at that for several months now. And deaths are starting to creep up again as well. Vaccination data. This just shows where we are in terms of number of doses. So unvaccinated, 1 dose, 2 dose, and 3 doses or booster across the home nations. We're somewhere at around 30%, about a third of people have had a booster. And this really is the number we have to concentrate on with Omicron. The early signs from the lab data is that Omicron can evade the vaccines better than other variants to date. It means you really need that third dose. So this is the number now that we really have to think about as fully vaccinated. And we have to get this number up. And equally, we have to get this unvaccinated number down. Now, this is a lot of children, but it's also, there's still about 5-6 million adults who've not been vaccinated at all. And just looking at the boosters, the government announced a big push to try and get more people boosted. We are boosting about 350,000 people a day. That is a lot, it's 2.5 million people a week. But we need to speed this up because of Omicron. This really needs to try and get up. We have to try and get up to the levels that we were doing back in the spring, which is very, very difficult because that really was on the backs of a lot of volunteers that aren't available right now. So where we are with Omicron, I'll start with kind of going back to South Africa, which is kind of the country that's seeing the biggest rises at the moment. And cases are still highest there in Gauteng province, which is where Johannesburg and Pretoria are. That's this red line. This is from the Ministry of Health briefing this morning at South Africa, where I took the graphs from. But all provinces are now seeing a steep increase in cases. So basically the rest of the country is catching up. And when you look at a map, you can see it kind of spreading out from Gauteng province. In terms of ages, their cases are highest in 20 to 39-year-olds, so it has been concentrated in younger adults so far, but it has started to move into the older groups. Positivity rates are also massively increasing in South Africa and back at near peak levels of 30% of people testing positive. So although they've massively increased the number of tests they're doing, it's not managing to keep up with the number of new cases. This is just looking at Gauteng province and the hospital admissions by age. And what they're seeing is that as the cases have moved into older age groups, they are now starting to see more older people go to hospital. So blue is 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago. Then you have orange is the week after that, and the grey is the most recent week. So we're seeing increases in the older age groups going to hospital. Now that's not a good thing. But what it does mean is that when they were really worried at seeing so many under 5s at the beginning, that now looks as if it's more likely a population effect of who was getting infected. So that is kind of a bit more promising news, is that it doesn't look as much as if younger children are being disproportionately affected. But it's still, still quite early days. And also, again, very preliminary data, but they showed this chart today of hospital admissions. These are cases in the orange and grey is admissions. And you can see that for this wave, the admissions are not keeping up with the cases. And there could be all kinds of reasons for that. It could be immunity from previous infection, immunity from vaccination, that it's a younger age group, or that there's something special about Omicron, or some combination of all of those things. But the kind of early signs are that cases, people who get it, are needing hospital less and needing less intensive care as well. So, as I said, it's very early. It's very early. We don't know how that's going to translate over to the UK population, which is quite different. But, it's better news than not having that. So, in England, the UK Health Security Agency released an interim report on Omicron on Wednesday, showing data up to the 5th of December. And what they looked at was what's called the S gene dropout, which is a way of kind of tracking Omicron without sequencing, where you're looking at PCR tests and seeing whether this particular gene is picked up or not. In Delta, it's picked up. In Omicron, it's not. And so basically, pretty much all S gene dropouts now are expected to be Omicron. And this black line is the percentage of positive cases that have this feature, so are likely to be Omicron. So you can see it's highest in the southeast. So on the 5th of December, it was almost 3% of cases in London, a bit like they were Omicron. And then the East Midlands but it's going up in every region. I mean, lowest in Yorkshire, but still you're starting to see it tick up. Now, there's more recent data available up to last Wednesday for the whole of England. This is a log plot, so this is not, this goes up in factors of 10. So you can see this exponential growth of Omicron. The most recent day, which is Wednesday, was almost 10% of positive tests were Omicron. On the 5th, it was kind of around there. And a week ago, when I was telling you about Omicron, it was about 1% of cases. So you can see in a week, it's gone from 1% to 10% of cases. So it is increasing very rapidly. Cases of Omicron are doubling every 2 to 3 days. That's where the urgency is coming from. And most people, including SAGE, are now expecting that by the end of the year, probably by Christmas, Omicron will be the dominant variant in the UK. And what that looks like, here's kind of a very simplistic projection forward. We're at about 45,000 cases of Delta a day in England. It's about, let's assume it's flat. It's actually been going up, but let's assume it's kind of roughly flat. And then as Omicron increases, because it's increasing so rapidly, by Christmas, you might expect to see, 30, 40,000, perhaps more cases of Omicron per day. We're currently at around here, so it's not making much of a dent on numbers, but we can see that it's starting to be a few thousand cases a day. If it's 10% of cases, it's about 2,000-3,000 cases today of Omicron. So it is increasing extremely fast. So just to summarize, cases are rising in the UK, and that's been Delta. They're now higher than they've been since July. Hospital admissions are increasing again, and these are also from Delta. So what we're getting is Omicron on top of a slowly growing Delta epidemic. Omicron is spreading rapidly in the UK, particularly England and Scotland, and it's expected to be dominant by the end of the year at the latest. Early indications from lab experiments are that Omicron does have significant immune escape, but it looks like boosters should still be effective, and that's why there's this big push to try and give boosters to as many people as possible. And where we are, which is different from South Africa, is that we already have a high Delta burden of COVID. So any growth in cases risks further unsustainable pressure on the NHS and more illness, death, and long COVID, because we don't have any kind of safety margin, unfortunately. And every day that we can slow down Omicron growth in the UK, we can boost more people. That's kind of that's the benefit of slowing it down. And SAGE, in fact, in their minutes this week, reiterated that slowing growth down is crucial right now. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Steve to talk through what Indy SAGE thinks we should be doing.
Okay, so I'm going to channel my best Chris Whitty. After all, we have the same hairstyle, and ask Christina if she can move on the slides when we're ready. So at one level, as Christina points out, the story is very complex. Many things we don't know about the new variant, but one thing we do know is that it's coming at us like an express train. The doubling rate of about two and a bit days means that about 3 doublings a week. So after 1 week, you've got 8 times as much, 2 weeks, 64 times as much, 3 weeks, 512 times as much. You can see that rate of growth if we do nothing. And therefore, it's very urgent to slow it down, to buy time. And as Christina says, that's crucial, number one, for getting more vaccines in arms, and number two, for understanding more about it, so we understand what has to be done in the longer term to overcome Omicron. So let me stress, what we're proposing here are the emergency short-term measures to slow growth. It's not a long-term strategy. That strategy will have to change possibly when we learn more about it. And let's hope it's good news so we don't have to be more restrictive. But nonetheless, we can't afford to wait. So let's look at what we've got to do. Next slide, please. Okay. So the things we can do, we should start doing immediately. But we know that they're going to have impacts over different timescales. So some of the things we'll start doing now won't bring results for weeks or possibly even months. And therefore, while they're absolutely critical, at the same time, we've got to act very quickly indeed. And in the short term, in a sense, there are three very simple things we can do. The first is, and it's probably the simplest thing about the pandemic overall, is that the more contacts you have with people, the more the infection spreads. And therefore, the more you limit contacts, the less it spreads. So it's very simple. We've got to limit contacts as much as possible. We've got to let people work at home when they can, so they don't mix with people on public transport, in bars, and at work. And in our social lives, we've got to make a very simple judgment. If we interact as if nothing was happening and we let the infection grow, then the very real danger is we'll be in a crisis at Christmas and we'll have to forego the interactions and the meetings that really matter to us. So we should think very carefully about meeting with others, very carefully about parties. How important are they? As I've said various times, it's a little bit like Christmas dinner. If you have too big a Christmas breakfast, you're going to ruin your Christmas lunch. So which matters more to you? So as I say, people should think very carefully about their contacts. And we need a government with the moral courage to ask people to do things which are important but may not be popular and may not be things we want to do. After all, none of us wants to limit our socializing at this time of year. The second thing is to make our contacts safer, so that when we interact, there is less of a probability of transmitting the virus. Now, there are various things we can do. We should certainly be wearing masks in all crowded spaces. That includes pubs and restaurants. We should ventilate as much as we can and make sure that we open the windows, at least occasionally, to let air in, and that there is good ventilation in public spaces. One particularly important thing we should do is to test ourselves before we meet up with others to check that we are negative and to check that we're not passing on the infection. That could be and should indeed be made a requirement of going into public spaces, a negative lateral flow test before you go to restaurants, before you go to clubs and pubs. But equally, if you're meeting up with loved ones, you should test yourself to make sure that you're not going to infect them. So if we all conscientiously did testing, made sure we were negative before we meet up with people, that would make a very substantial difference. And what's more, if we find we are positive, we should self-isolate and close contact should self-isolate. But let me make a key point here. It's a point we've been making throughout the pandemic, and to some extent it's been forgotten. We know that many people don't self-isolate because they can't afford to. And we know that many people don't get tested because they can't afford to find out that they're positive and they have to self-isolate. So self-isolation and these policies of keeping us safe depend upon support from the government. When the government says, act responsibly, yes, people are acting responsibly, but they also need the support to do the right thing. And adequate support for self-isolation is probably more critical right now than it's ever been. And yet that issue has never been properly addressed. Next slide, please. In the medium term, we need to improve the environments in which we interact and in which we live, to make sure there is proper ventilation, to make sure there is proper air filtration. And it's particularly important we do that for children. Again, this has been something that many have called for. This is something that many countries have done to install CO2 monitors, to install ventilation or air filtration, and we haven't done it. And again, over the Christmas break, we have an opportunity to make sure that our schools are properly ventilated and that our children are kept safe. And it is still incomprehensible to many of us why that isn't happening. We also need to ventilate public spaces. There should be a fund made available. So again, the pubs and clubs and restaurants can install proper ventilation, and they should display publicly the levels of ventilation and mitigations in those spaces, because that will give people confidence as to what spaces are safe. It will give us more choice. And again, it will give us more opportunity to stay safe. And there should also be an agreed system of international travel. Let me stress the point. The red list, quite frankly, now makes no sense at all. A red list on South Africa simply punishes a country which actually had the decency and the moral courage to explain what was going on, to do the sequencing, to find out the problem and alert us to the problem. The red list doesn't protect us very much and simply punishes them. Rather, we should have an international system, an agreed system, a consensual system of pre and post-travel testing, plus supported quarantine. Again, we don't want to get back into the mess we had before of cowboy companies overcharging people for tests and putting them up in substandard accommodation. We need proper testing through the NHS. We need decent standards of quarantine. And where people are coming for essential reasons, for family reasons, for funerals, for instance, there should be funds to support them to do so. Next slide. And in the long term, yes, we should start the vaccination immediately, but a lot of work is required to roll it out more fully. We need to get the volunteers who work so magnificently early on in the year to be involved. And we also need to consider extending vaccination to under 12s once that is approved by the MHRA. There's one final point I want to make, and I think it's an absolutely critical point and a point we should never forget. This is an international crisis, we know that. And we know the new Omicron variant arose, at least in part, because in many parts of the world, people aren't vaccinated and the infection is raging and more new variants can arise as a consequence. And yet the problem is that as soon as there's a crisis here, we suddenly become terribly parochial and we forget about the international element. And so, although I've put it last, in many ways, it's the most important thing. In terms of our strategy, we should start by asking, how can we make sure the world is vaccinated? And the shameful truth is that our country is blocking that by blocking the waiver of vaccine patents. So right now, our government should support the waiver of vaccine patents. And on top of that, it should provide transfer of technology and of expertise so we can build vaccine hubs in all parts of the world, and they can have their own vaccines and they can get on top of those infections and therefore save lives domestically, but also make for a safer world overall. And that's it, the end.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. And thank you, Christina, for the update on the latest figures as well. And now we're going to go to Dr. Helen Salisbury, who's going to introduce today's guests and the topic. So Helen, over to you.
Hello. We designed the session before the latest wave, but I think it's still very relevant. And we thought about it in the context of Delta, but I think with the Omicron wave coming, it's still very much what we need to talk about. And we were thinking about what's an acceptable number of deaths in a pandemic, and how come we have got to a stage when we kind of 100+ deaths every day from this virus is not even remarked upon. So we've assembled a wonderful team of guests today to just think about our attitude to deaths from COVID and how that might have changed, and also who has been dying from COVID. So I don't want to talk too much myself because I really want to give the floor to them. But first of all, I'd like to welcome Rachel Clark. And my first question to her is, given that we've now got, the Office of National Statistics thinks we've had 170,000 deaths from COVID in this country. And there was a lot of talk at the start about shielding the most vulnerable. How's that actually worked out in practice? Rachel.
Hi, and thanks very much for inviting me. So I'm a palliative care doctor, which means I see typically very vulnerable patients, often elderly, approaching the end of their life. So I'm witnessing firsthand the reality that underlies that soft, warm rhetoric that we heard so much at the start of this pandemic. We heard from the government that those who were vulnerable would be cocooned, they'd be protected. It was all about shielding the vulnerable. Of course, what actually happened was very, very different. And that today is reflected in some pretty stark statistics. So just to give you one example, Some research that was published this summer by Public Health England shows that people with learning disabilities are 8 times as likely as the general population to die from COVID. If you have Down syndrome, you are 36 times more likely to die from COVID. Those are shocking statistics. And they're reflected by what I saw day to day in clinical practice. If you think back to last year, there was this tremendous effort to expand ICU capacity, acquire enough ventilators. But of course, the vast majority of people who have died from COVID have never been fit or robust enough to receive ICU level care. They're the people who died in care homes, 40,000 of them, or in hospices. And what's really shocking, underlying the warm words, is the extent to which those vulnerable individuals were just thrown to the wolves. They were just abandoned. So one example, the hospice where I was working at the start of the first wave, we received the standard PPE supply that every hospice, every care home got in the country. And it was a box containing 1 roll of plastic aprons, 1 box of paper masks, and 2 boxes of gloves. And we worked out that our box of masks would keep us going for a few days at most. We got in touch with senior levels at the Department of Health to say, if you cannot give us more masks, we are going to have to close the hospice, and our patients who are dying, many of them, they're literally in the last days of their lives, we're going to have to turf them out and send them into A&E, which is itself filled with COVID. And the person we spoke to in the Department of Health, supposedly from the 24/7 PPE hotline, said, essentially, not my problem, nothing I can do, go away. And it was only by begging a charity that we managed to get our masks and stay open. So that's a really stark example of, frankly, the contempt with which vulnerable individuals have been treated in this pandemic. And I think we have to be honest and recognise that underlying the warm words, what we've really seen since February last year is a kind of dividing of British society into 2 tiers of patients and people. There is tier 1, the people who are worth saving because they're young enough or economically productive enough to be worth saving. And then there's tier 2, and they're the expendable people. And we can pretend that we're going to help protect and cocoon them, but really all they get is shielding, which is stay at home, be by yourself, and hope that somehow one day it will be safe enough for you to go out and not catch a disease that claims your life. And I think in asking that question, how many deaths are acceptable from COVID? And of course, there will be a number that's acceptable. We can't eradicate infectious causes of death, but we have to recognise that at the moment there's that 2-tier division. And it's unfolding every day in hospitals, even today. And we need to be upfront and honest about it and say, right, when we're trying to compute the acceptable number of deaths, what are the implications of that calculation for how much we really value every member of British society? Because if it's a 2-tier system, I think the public needs to be part of the honest and open debate about that and whether or not that's really how we want to live.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I just wonder, as a kind of extension of that, I wonder if you could comment at all. In the first wave, there was a real concern about do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation, GNA CPR orders, and the way in which they were put in place very rapidly that caused a lot of concern. Is that something you experienced?
It's such an important thing to raise, Helen, because at the start of the first wave, there was an enormous amount of fear generated by the publicity around inappropriate DNA CPR orders being put in place. And that was subsequently investigated by the CQC and the Care Quality Commission, who found that yes, indeed, in a small number of cases, individual doctors would impose a blanket DNA CPR form on all of the residents of an entire care home, for example. And that is absolutely the farthest thing from good practice. You should never, ever make judgments about whether or not resuscitation CPR is appropriate on a whole group of individuals. It should always be a careful individual decision, and it should be based around objective criteria. Do we or do we not think this individual would stand a realistic chance of benefiting from CPR? Because if not, there are lots of harms associated with resuscitation. I feel awful about the fear that generated, and I think it arose because in the mad scramble to build capacity at the start of the pandemic, individuals felt in an impossible situation. They wanted to protect patients from coming into hospital with COVID and the associated harms of dying in a heavily medicalized area where they would never, ever see their loved ones again because visiting was not allowed by and large in the first wave. I think people were genuinely trying to do the right thing, but actually with awful unintended consequences. Very, very quickly and rightly, this was highlighted and it was stopped. And I, from my own experience, can say that literally every single doctor I work with thinks exceptionally carefully about resuscitation decisions, and we never impose them unthinkingly on individuals. It's a really difficult, fine-tuned decision. We will always try to have that conversation with a patient, if not the patient, then with their family. And we will always try and communicate as carefully and objectively as we can the pros and cons of CPR, just as we would any other treatment. I do think very quickly it's also worth mentioning, however, the context of what happens in the NHS when resources are overwhelmed. So the last time that happened was obviously December, January, February this year. We're hoping very much we won't see a rerun of those overwhelmed conditions with Omicron. But when the NHS is overwhelmed, when there aren't enough beds, staff, ICU spaces and ventilators, the decision-making is very, very fraught. If you have two patients in front of you as an ICU doctor, and you know that there's only one spare ventilator in your unit, you have to make exceptionally difficult decisions about who gets the ventilator. Ideally, you would send the other patient to another ICU in another hospital so that they too could receive a ventilator if it was appropriate. But the reality of what happened in January, and I know this from conversations with colleagues, is that the capacity wasn't there. And I fear that sometimes people who are under ordinary circumstances might have benefited from a ventilator did not necessarily get it because everybody was frantically scrabbling with the lack of capacity. That's why every measure to slow down Omicron cases today is so very important. That's what protecting the NHS means. It means trying to make sure that everybody who could benefit from an ICU bed, and that includes cancer patients, heart disease patients, road traffic accident patients, as well as COVID patients, all those vulnerable patients get the treatment they need. And it is not rationed because we've run out of resources.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm going to hand over to Susan now to introduce our next guest.
Thank you. So I wanted to pick up this idea of acceptable level of deaths that we've heard a lot about from government and media, and ask Professor Elizabeth Stokoe, what's counted as acceptable deaths over this pandemic, both in the government and the media?
Yeah, I've been tracking back over the use of acceptable in association with COVID in the news, and at least one distinction that you can see is whether or not it gets marked as problematic. So, for example, with scare quotes. So acceptable wasn't scare quoted at first, but it was used in association with things like levels of cases, protective measures, the accuracy of data, although some of this was about deaths, but sort of euphemistically. And then in the UK, the phrase "an acceptable level of mortality" seemed to appear around the 7th of April, and the phrase "acceptable level of death" towards the end of April, but largely as something that we shouldn't become immune to. And then, of course, deaths themselves have been framed quite differently across the arc of the pandemic as well. So reporting started case by case, and we talked of COVID killing people, we talked of the COVID death toll, fatalities. And taking 50, for example, that was a large number. Deaths had risen to 50. It was a failure. It was a terrible milestone, and it was unacceptable. And then the tone of public discourse was quite consistent at the start, but then it began to split and polarize along a continuum. So on the one hand, those very same numbers became acceptable, small, something that had fallen to, or it was evidence of success and mobilized in favor of moving on and living with it. And on the other hand, just yesterday on Channel 4, an expert was quoted as saying 150 deaths a day is an unacceptably high number.
Well, I'm glad to hear that the unacceptable level of deaths is creeping in, and I think that's something we really need to pick up and run with. You mentioned this other phrase, learning to live with it. Again, that somehow got traction and been repeated in the media by government. But what does it mean? It seems to me it's being used as an excuse to not have strategies and mitigations to bring down the level of the virus of COVID.
Yeah. So learning to live with it is used sort of like an idiom, and because our daily language is full of idiomatic type things, we know how people use them in writing and talk, often to frame something as self-evident or to end or disengage with an argument, at the end of the day, and just live with it. And so to live with something, of course, means to accept or continue something that is difficult or unpleasant, something that we have to bear or endure or suffer. These are just all things out of the dictionary when you can see it used daily. And the second thing to think about is the it in living with it. And it's almost always used negatively. So pre-COVID, it referred to illness and disease or the economy, climate change issues, personal crises. And during COVID, the it sometimes referred to something specific, but is often quite opaque, where it does a lot of sort of woolly damage. And I suppose the other couple of things to say is that the learn or learning and living bits also typically convey one of three things. So adapting or behaving differently in a new norm sort of way, used constructively, but about something still negative, or as a moral principle that we shouldn't learn to live with it, or accepting and sort of old normalizing, giving up and ignoring. And so finally, I think it's quite important to look at who is using the phrase. Is it a hot Twitter take? Is it an expert? Or is it a government minister articulating strategy, as you say? So in March last year, the Director General of the World Health Organization talked about the possible moral decay in not taking the deaths of vulnerable people seriously, and said, pandemic doesn't mean that we say it's fine to live with it. Fast forward to November this year, the Health Secretary said we must learn to live with the virus as we do with flu. And so we've got these positions quite polarised again. And I think to sum this up, you've got on the one hand, what comes of Johnson's party donor serving living with COVID in scare quotes idiocy, versus COVID is here to stay and we just need to carry on as normal and learn to live with it.
Thanks, really interesting. And now I will hand back to Helen.
Hello again. And our final guest today is Professor John Drury. And I just wanted to ask you some questions, if that's all right, about what people are doing, what the general public and what their reaction to the high levels of COVID are. Because the ONS surveys have persistently shown that the general public are more keen on measures to suppress COVID than actually they're being told to, and they're often ahead of the government in doing the right thing in terms of behaviour. So, why is it that there's so little pressure for more regulation when that seems to be what people want? We've got lots of anti-vaxxers on the street. We haven't got pro-mask wearers out protesting. What's going on? John?
Well, this is a question that researchers of collective action address quite a lot. So anger, dissatisfaction, frustration are predictors. They are associated with people coming out on the streets, but often only quite weakly. Other factors seem to matter. And what often matters for bringing people out on the streets is the belief that others, that people in our reference groups, feel that dissatisfaction, feel that anger, that they're going to come out onto the street. Now, as you said, it's not as if people are not angry, not satisfied, unhappy with what the government are being doing. There are high levels of dissatisfaction. But it looks as if people think the people that are unhappy feel that they're in a minority, that they think that others are not angry, they do not feel the same way as them. That's one of the reasons why people might not be coming onto the streets. I mean, you might apply the same principle to mask wearing. Why has mask wearing declined so rapidly after so-called Freedom Day? It wasn't only because of the change in the mandate, it was because people saw others in their peer group who not wearing masks and then assumed that they didn't want to wear masks. So it conveyed the message that we, our peer groups and others, don't think masks are the right thing to do anymore.
Thank you. And just to bring things right up to date, I just wonder what impact you think the exposure this week of the government's failure to follow its own rules last year, is that going to make a difference to the public response to tighter rules that are clearly on their way, well, have arrived?
Well, there was some research carried out last year on the so-called Cummings effect, and we know that it was certainly associated with a loss of trust in the ability of the government to deal competently with the pandemic. And that in turn was associated with a decline in adherence. And we know that some people at least used the Cummings example as a reason or an excuse not to follow the guidelines that were then operating. But it's important, I think, also to not overstate that effect. So some people were certainly affected by it in terms of their choices not to adhere, but others were affected in the opposite way. Some said, I don't want to be like Cummings, and there is evidence that some people continue to adhere to disassociate themselves from people like him. So there are different responses across the population. And the other thing to say about this is, although trust in government competence is consistently found as a predictor of adherence, it's not the only one, and it's not the major one. I think the major predictors of adherence are, first of all, the perception of risk to us, to our community, to our family, and so on. That's a major predictor of adherence. Our understanding of the efficacy of mitigation measures. And the other one that keeps coming up is group norms, the extent to which our peers, the others, are adhering, are adopting these behaviours, and in particular, people in our in-groups, relevant others, the extent to which they are adhering.
Thank you so much, John. I think we're probably now going to move to some questions.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you, Rachel, Liz and John as well. Really, really important discussion, very wide-ranging and very emotive, but with those statistics there, even more emotive, in fact. So we are going to take some questions from the press and public, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. I'd like to invite Nigel Nelson from the Sunday People to kick us off. Nigel.
Thanks very much, Alice. Stephen outlined the extra restrictions that are needed now, and John just made the point that actually people will adhere to them if they think that they are sensible. Looking ahead a couple of weeks to Christmas week, if Omicron is not slowed down by then, would you favour going into a lockdown over Christmas on the basis it's the one thing that's been shown to always bring infections down?
Thank you very much, Nigel. I mean, an incredibly difficult decision for anybody to make. Who would like to start with that? Are we going to have to bring in further restrictions pretty swiftly at some point? What do we think the future holds? Martin, I wonder if you might want to start.
Yeah, oh God, what a difficult question. Obviously, the words lockdown are incredibly emotive, and there are a lot of things that can be done, as Steve has already said, before we get anywhere near that. But the danger is that if we don't do all of those things, then we are at risk of having to do something like that. And then, of course, that will bring the cases down. And we've seen that's been done very successfully in Austria. In particular, if you look, they've really brought them down dramatically. But, we shouldn't get ourselves in that position. That's the last place we want to be. And I think Steve set out very clearly a whole lot of other things that can be done first.
Thank you very much, Martin. Would anybody else like to comment on this? I mean, the numbers are increasing so rapidly. We need to put some very serious brakes on, don't we? Steve? Steve, you're muted.
You would have thought I'd learned. I'm going to start off by biting your hand, I'm afraid. One of the real problems in the way in which this is debated is all COVID measures are talked about as restrictions. So they are something which the government imposes on people, which does to people. But actually, many of the things that we're calling for right now are about support being absolutely critical. We've got to support people to self-isolate. We've got to protect people by making sure that venues are safe. I think one of the problems is if you talk about all measures as restrictions, and then restrictions become lockdown, people become more negative about them and are less likely to do them. And the point that Martin made is, if we don't do the things that we suggest, and we don't limit our contacts, and we don't make our contacts safer, then the infection will spread, and we will be forced into a position where we do have to bring in more restrictive policies. So it will be the failure to go along with the sorts of things that we are proposing, and therefore the increase of contacts and the increase of infection, which would bring in the things that nobody wants around Christmas. So the very simple message in the end is, if we want to have the possibility of a decent Christmas this year, then please be careful. Please limit the interactions that you have, and please make sure that if you interact, you do so safely, having taken a COVID test before you meet up with everyone. That's the best way to avoid ruining Christmas.
Thank you very much. And I think, Helen, you wanted to comment as well.
I was only going to say, I think there are so many unknowns at this point to do with vaccine escape and to do with severity. I don't think we can, from where we are now, we can predict what's going to be necessary. We should take those steps that Stephen's put in place. We need to be careful right now. I am keeping every digit crossed that actually it turns out to be not nearly as bad as we fear, and so that more so that we don't have to be so afraid, and we can relax some of those restrictions and get about the life we want to lead. But we just don't know at the moment, and for the moment we do need to do everything we can to stop the spread.
Thank you, Helen. Professor Anthony Costello, did you want to say something here?
No, it was more or less what Helen said. There's a lot of uncertainty right now, and we can't rule anything in or out, absolutely. But we just have to do everything that Steve said and see to what extent we can reduce the spread of this virus.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nigel, for your question. And moving on now to James Metcalf. James, over to you for your question.
Thanks for having me on, everyone. I mean, mine leads on to off from there. It's more looking ahead to January, February, and March. I mean, so obviously the government's been super slow and chaotic with restrictions that they've brought in, and this time to manage the COVID waves. And this time seems similar with, Boris Johnson's party, which isn't going to be great for adherence. So I was just wondering how you saw January, March panning out, because Stephen's messages about, limiting contacts were great, but a lot of people don't know about them. They've logged on to what Plan B is, and they're just saying, if you can work from home, work from home. So the next couple of weeks, certainly me as a fairly informed member of the general public, I don't know to limit contacts other than working from home.
Thank you very much, James. Professor Susan Mickey.
Well, I mean, as has been said before, none of us can look into a crystal ball, but what we can do is identify the things that are pushing in one direction and the things that are pushing in another direction. So the things that are optimistic are that the boosters are effective. But another really key thing is, as has been said earlier, is people's behaviour. Now, we don't always know how people are going to behave, but the pattern has been throughout this pandemic that when people see there's a big threat, when they see they can do something about it, they tend to behave in a pretty sensible way. So that's all optimistic. But as also has been said, we don't know quite how much the new variant is going to escape the vaccine. We also don't know what sort of messaging is going to be coming from the government. At the moment, it's what we've seen, unfortunately, quite a lot of, the kind of mixed and contradictory messaging. So we've got some things that are pointing in a direction that we might be all right, but other things that are pointing in the opposite direction. And there's so many moving parts. All we can do at this stage is say, these are the things that's going to maximize the chance that we won't have to have really serious restrictions. But when you see the kind of graphs of exponential rise that Christina's shown, you can see this is a really worrying situation.
The general pandemic response in this country seems to have been to cross your fingers and hope that it's not going to turn out as badly as it looks. And we've been badly burned by that before. I wonder if I could ask Professor Carl Friston to comment on this to help us perhaps look into the future. I know it's difficult because of the levels of uncertainty. Carl?
Yes, I won't repeat that. It is terribly difficult because the levels of uncertainty. What we do know is that by January, a lot of the uncertainty will have been resolved. So we do know that. I think the key question, in fact, if I can go back to the previous question, if Omicron had arrived de novo, we should certainly be locking down now and getting on top of it. Why aren't we doing that? Well, because it's happening in a particular context, in a very special context, which is a very high burden of Delta. And that provides a context which introduces enormous uncertainty. And there are two key questions, one of which is, will Omicron have a greater or lesser virulence in terms of causing morbidity? But in terms of what the picture is going to look like in January, probably the more urgent question is, does the presence of Delta contextualize and shape the expression of Omicron? So if you remember Christina's graph, she assumed a linear mixture of the viral spread due to Omicron and the viral spread due to Delta. So you've got basically two separable pandemics in play at the same time, a pure twindemic. Now that would be devastating. If that is the case, then we should certainly be locking down now. But there's another scenario, another narrative that means that there may be, through all sorts of mechanisms, things like cross-immunoreactivity and the like, that there's going to be a competition. And that competition speaks to this interaction between these two variants. Now, if that's the case, we have a very, very different picture. And in fact, one could argue a slightly more comforting narrative, and we're replacing a very virulent Delta with a hopefully less virulent Omicron. So that's the big question that everybody wants answered, but we just don't know the answer to that until the real world data reveals itself, and that will take at least 3 to 4 weeks.
In this situation again, aren't we, of living in the experiment? Zubaida Haque, you want to say something?
Oh yes, I mean, James, time and time again, the government have overlooked the role of schools in transmission. And one of the most unforgivable things about Plan B is that it doesn't take into account children at all. It's more or less completely targeted at ads. There are no measures whatsoever for children. So come January and February, I think the key question to ask is, are the government going to do anything more for schools? Now, we know that JCVI have now said that teenagers, 12 to 15-year-olds, can get their second jabs, and hopefully that will be rolled out much faster than it was this term, and that'll be important. But then we've got the under 12s, haven't we? And we've heard nothing. We've heard nothing from the MHRA, let alone JCVI. And we know that in terms of the under 12s, they have the highest infection rates ever in this pandemic. So I think in that sense, there's real concerns, because even without Omicron, with Delta rates, with daily cases over 50,000, that's a huge concern. It's winter. With Omicron, it's going to get a bit worse. So yes, boosters will help adults, but they won't do anything for children. And then the key question is how will the impact of schools affect communities? So we just don't know right now.
Thank you, Zubaida. James, thank you very much for your question. I'm going to squeeze in another couple of questions. Next one from Colin Pigeon. Colin.
Hello. That's good timing, actually, because I was going to ask about schools specifically. it's a two-part question, really, coming at the issue from two different angles. I'm a parent governor of a school where I have 3 children, one of whom, unfortunately, is off and has been off all term with long COVID. Now, in Northern Ireland, school governors have a duty of care to safeguard and promote the welfare and protection of pupils. That's a statutory duty. The wording might be slightly different across the UK, but broadly, I think it's the same. So my question is really, how do governors show evidence that they are actually achieving this in the current situation, given what we know about the numbers in schools? And secondly, and it's related, I've heard of parents being prosecuted for not sending their children to schools on the grounds that they believe them to be unsafe because of inadequate ventilation or whatever. So is there anything that schools should be doing to demonstrate that their buildings are safe? How do they reassure parents if they do have safe buildings? What's the evidence around school safety? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin, for that incredibly important question. And it does just feel as though we've dragged our feet incredibly with schools during this pandemic, and that we should have been doing something, by the summer of 2020. I thought that we were going to be putting air filtration into classrooms over the summer of 2020. And we're still in a situation where there's inadequate ventilation in most classrooms. And we know that would make a massive, massive difference. But I mean, what can governors reasonably do? Has anybody on the panel got any ideas for Colin? It's a very, very tricky situation. Anthony?
Well, one thing would be to write to Nadhim Zahawi, the minister, to find out whether the carbon dioxide monitors that were promised in September by the previous education secretary, have they been delivered? And if not, why not? And what's the target? I agree with you that, I mean, the shocking thing is that a big study earlier in the year showed that 1 in 7 children get long COVID symptoms. And your child is an example and has been off. And that should worry all of us. And that's why we should have rolled out our vaccines much earlier. I mean, they were approved back in June, and we didn't start rolling them out effectively till September, and we're still at low rates. And we haven't taken a decision yet about 5 to 11-year-olds. And yet in America, they're rolling that out, and they're starting to do it in other countries. We are being very slow. The British are always bad at protecting children. We don't think about children in terms of climate change either. I completely agree with you. And I think it's scandalous that parents who keep their children out of school for the very good reasons that, as Christina's evidence shows, they're dangerous places, should be prosecuted. And yet certain other people are not being prosecuted.
Yeah, we do know that there are some lawyers helping in that respect. The Good Law Project, for instance, is helping families who have extreme clinical vulnerabilities, who have appallingly been threatened with fines for keeping their children off school. And we've also heard this week of children who've been punished by schools for wearing masks in schools. So I think it's distressing for children and for their parents as well, that they're not able to protect themselves, and that there aren't those kind of wider protections in terms of making classrooms safer. Thank you, Colin, for your question. We are very much, supporting you. And I'm sorry that we couldn't give you any kind of, not better advice, but sort of wider advice. It's a very difficult situation to be in, but it's also very important to hear your voice. Thank you.
Thanks.
Question now from Howard Horsfall. Howard.
Hello, can you hear me all?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, good. It's in 2 parts. Somewhere in my previous research, I read that there is a limit to the number of mutations that a virus can undergo. Is this true, and what are the consequences of each mutation? Second part, is it the case that a mutated virus may achieve greater transmissibility at the expense of retaining its potency, i.e., as the ability to survive by mutations goes up the ladder, the possibility to deliver serious infection goes down the snake?
Thank you very much, Howard. Very interesting questions. Just from the perspective of evolutionary biology and evolution, mutations don't stop. That's kind of how evolution works. But I wonder if anybody would like to tackle some of the nuggets there within Howard's question. Who better than Professor Danny Altman?
Yeah, I'll I'll have a go. Yes. So, like everything for this virus, somewhat uncharted territory, but the few facts we can put in place are, first of all, obviously famous last words. When all this started, we said it was a family of viruses that mutated rather slowly, which, although it doesn't feel like it now, is still true compared to ones that mutate fast. And we also said that from what we knew about other viruses like HIV, there is a kind of end game. There is a cost to all mutations because any mutation could either have a positive effect, a negative effect, or a neutral effect in the host, the arms race between the host and the virus. And for things like HIV, you quite rapidly reach a stage where for any virus that could confer greater immune evasion or transmissibility, there's just as much of a chance of it making the virus less fit. And with Delta, we thought we were getting close to that point. Again, famous last words. With Omicron, we clearly haven't. But there is a kind of balancing end game that who knows where it approaches, but it's maybe on the horizon. Who knows?
That's really interesting, Danny, because so that kind of makes it a game of kind of chance and probability, but
yes,
it's constrained by the limits. So as you get to being a more kind of virulent virus, it's more likely actually that any other mutations that come along are going to push you away from that rather than push you to that very extreme end.
It's flipping a coin. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Howard, for that question. I want to squeeze in just a couple more questions. We've got a question from Divya Shrivastava. Divya. Hello, I think you're muted. I can see you popping up. I wonder if we're going to be able to hear you as well. Oh, Divya is experiencing some technical difficulties. Can you unmute yourself? Divya, we can't hear you. If you'd like to type your question into the chat, I will read it out for you. And meanwhile, I'm going to invite another questioner in. But Divya, if you can send us your question in that way, that would be brilliant. Anne Ashworth, I wonder if the technology is going to be on your side.
Well, let's hope so. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much for having me on, and thank you to everybody for everything you do. My question was submitted on the 1st of December, which seems like a lifetime ago with concern of Christmas parties. But my question is, should we go to a Christmas party where we assume everyone is double vaccinated and boosted? And this is in the context of A, visiting vulnerable relatives over Christmas, and B, the Christmas party that occurred in Oslo, where they did test themselves. They were all double vaccinated, but since the party, I think it's about 80% of them have tested positive, as have subsequent visitors to that restaurant. Thank you.
Parties, it's a very personal choice, isn't it? How about you, Helen? What do you feel about this?
Hi, I think, Anne, you may have answered your own question with quoting the really, really difficult situation that they had in Norway, was it, with the party where everyone was double jabbed and everyone took a lateral flow before they went, but nevertheless, there was it was a real super spreader event. And I think that really tells us that you can't rely on other people being double vaxxed and everyone having a negative lateral flow that day to be completely safe. I certainly myself wouldn't be going to any parties in the lead up to Christmas. I think it would be a daft thing to do. And I think most people can see the total illogicality of the government's advice at the moment, which is work from home, but go to parties. I mean, it just makes no sense at all, does it? And parties tend to be loud places. People talk loudly, they sing, loads of virus. If anyone's got it, that's where it gets spread. So it's miserable, isn't it? But I just wouldn't party at this point.
Thanks, Helen. It is desperately miserable, isn't it? But I think that on an individual basis, I think that is incredibly helpful. And what Steve said earlier, I thought that was a really helpful way to think about it. To think about your Christmas breakfast and your Christmas dinner, and to go, do I eat the breakfast shall I save myself for the dinner? And it's going to be a kind of personal decision, and it's about what's important to individual people. Susan.
Yeah, just to say, the university I work at a couple of weeks ago, they asked us to cancel Christmas parties. And I think a lot of employers are doing that because they don't want to be responsible for a lot of their employees getting sick. But, people have been really looking forward to this Christmas and to parties because we've lived without them for so long. And it, as you said, Alice, it's been miserable. And I think one thing is to ask employers, don't cancel them, but postpone them. Have them next year so we can have a spring party in the hope that we've got out of this by next spring. And then that gives people something to look forward to, and it's not such a loss. So I think anybody who's listening to this and they're wondering about it, I'd say if it's a work party or something else with friends or whatever, and you think maybe we shouldn't be going, is why not agree or ask your employer to put it on next year instead?
Don't cancel it. Just postpone the fun. Lovely. We've got the question from Divya now, who unfortunately couldn't read it out herself, but this is what she was going to ask. Given the high case rates in school-age children, why isn't IndieSage suggesting that primary school children in years 4 to year 6 wear masks in school? Because obviously there's no mask wearing in primary schools unless children choose to do so. And actually in secondary schools, there's no mask wearing in classrooms. There's mask wearing in corridors, but once you actually get into the space that you're going to be spending an hour with all those other people, you take your mask off. So what do we think about mask wearing for primary age children, Zubaida?
Well, I think at the very minimum, if children in years 4, 5 and 6 or 7 and 5 and 6 want to wear masks in primary schools, they should be allowed to. We've heard some awful cases where children have wanted to go in wearing their masks and they've been told that they can't, which is appalling. So I think at the very minimum, they should be allowed to. I think the bigger question, Divya, is around the fact that in primary schools, there's literally no mitigations at the moment. Even now, even with the further measures, protective measures brought in, there are no mitigations in primary schools. So if a primary school child is in a household where there is COVID infection, that child can still come to school. That child can still spread the virus. So face masks is certainly one thing that can be done. And I think if children want to, they should be encouraged. But we need to look at more broader measures. We need to think about ventilation. We need to think about air filtration devices. I mean, it is astonishing that 18 months in, we still have nothing in primary schools. No ventilation, no air filtration devices, nothing. So at the very minimum, I think this Christmas, the government needs to fund and put in ventilation, air filtration devices as much as they can in as many schools as they can.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. And we know that COVID is spreading and it's having an impact in schools. We know that many, many children are off either with COVID or isolating. And we just see the same pattern every half term. We see cases steadily rising until you get to either half term or a break like Christmas. And then it happens again as the children go back to school, because there's nothing stopping that spread.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes, go on.
So I was going to add one more thing, which is children don't live in vacuums. They live in households with clinically vulnerable parents, with clinically vulnerable family members, with grandparents. So it's not, we should be protecting children for their own health. We should be protecting children against long COVID, but we should also be thinking about the fact that they go back into households, they can bring the virus back into the community as well. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. I'm going to have to wrap it up there for today. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you to Rachel, John Drury and Liz Stocko for joining us today and leading our discussion. And thank you to all the independent SAGE scientists for your continued hard work and for volunteering. All of them are volunteers with Independent SAGE. As Christmas approaches, we hope you get to spend time with loved ones. We should remember to take all the necessary precautions to keep ourselves and others safe. And there are these recommendations from Independent SAGE that you can find on the website that Steve Reicher introduced today. It's incredibly important that we do try to slow the virus spreading and to reduce its chance to mutate further as well. We'll be back same time next week for the final Independent Sage session of 2021. So please send us your questions. Stay safe, keep well.
Thanks, Alice. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.